the central point that Jeremy started with about these revolutions really being human dignity revolutions is what I wanted to emphasize about Ukraine. And when I was there a couple of weeks ago, that was the thing that struck me the most, is the core, what first brought people out onto the square, and then what brought more and more people out was precisely what Jeremy said. What summed it up the most for me was a couple of days after the Maidan success and after President Yanukovych fled the country. Someone who had been in the Maidan, and it was characterized, as I think a lot of these revolutions are, by a high degree of self-organization. So just some person who had been active put out on the internet, and immediately this went viral, the 10 commandments of the new Ukraine. The first commandment was, don't accept bribes and don't pay bribes. Other commandments were, be tidy, widen your horizons by traveling and by working abroad, but come back home in the end. Another one was, help old people around you. So it was very much this idea of improving yourself and beginning with the way that you personally behave as a form of social renewal. And I very much agree with Jeremy. I think that there's sometimes both a temptation for us on the outside to kind of succumb to Orientalism, or in the former Soviet case, a kind of, incense-scented and icon way of looking at things. And that's something which the authoritarian regimes that are threatened by these uprisings really encourage, this notion of, that democracy stuff, it might be okay for you Canadians or Americans or Western Europeans, but our people are different, and it's about different things happening here. And I think Jeremy was really right to emphasize that that's not really the dynamic that's going on. There are elements of that, for sure, but it's not the core thing. So, in talking a little bit about what I think is going on in Ukraine and in Russia, because the two are now so closely connected, I wanted to start by going back to the period when I first started to live and work in Ukraine, and I first met Jeremy, one of our finest diplomats. I was first in Ukraine in 1988-89 when I was an exchange student at the University of Kyiv. So that was full-on, total Soviet Union. And I started working there as a stringer for the FT, The Economist, and The Washington Post in the spring of 1991. Soviet Union still existed. What I think we're seeing in Ukraine and also in Russia is the second act of the 1991 revolution. So the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism in the Central European countries, and then ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union happened only partially in all the countries apart from Central Europe and the Baltics. For that revolution to be successful, what you needed is to build civil society, to build effective and democratic government institutions, to build a fair rule of law market economy, and to build some effective idea of post-Soviet nationhood. The Baltic republics and Central Europe have really succeeded in doing those things. Their task wasn't as great. They had the nationhood piece more complete when their revolutions began. They had stronger civil societies. They had more effective government institutions, although they also paid more attention with their lustration process, particularly in Czechoslovakia. But particularly in Ukraine and Russia, which is what's at stake right now, the process was very incomplete. And what we're seeing now, first with the Maidan uprising, and now with Russia's reaction to it, is the next act in that incomplete revolution. So let's start with Ukraine. What happened there over the past 4 months, and what is it the product of? Ukraine became independent, and it's important, I think, especially now when we're hearing from the Kremlin a sort of story about Ukraine being an ersatz or a fake state. It's important to remember it's actually been an independent country for almost 23 years. You know, to an old person like me, that might not seem like such a long time, but I'll bet you some of you here are about as old as the independent Ukrainian state, right? So quite a lot can happen in 23 years. When Ukraine became independent, what came together in that moment in 1991 was an alliance between the local, and they were generally Ukrainian nationalist in the sense that they wanted independence, democracy activists, and the communist elite. So Ukraine, like the countries of Central Europe, had a pro-democracy movement that had been growing in the 80s. Lots of dissidents, lots of Ukrainians had been repressed. Chernobyl and environmentalism was a very important rallying point in the late 80s, and they started to get strong. But they realized, partly because Soviet rule was so entrenched in Ukraine, partly because this notion of Ukrainian nationhood was quite fragile, the Ukrainian Democrats understood that they weren't going to succeed on their own. And so they did a deal with the Soviet nomenclatura, in particular with Leonid Kravchuk. And, you know, this wasn't ever written down in paper, but the implicit deal was, we will support you guys in remaining in power, becoming the leadership of independent Ukraine, as long as you support our goal for Ukrainian independence. And that's what happened. And one of the underreported stories, I think in 1991, was the extent to which it was sort of the surprise defection of Ukrainian communists from the Soviet project that drove the collapse of the Soviet Union. You still hear some echoes of that, a little bit from Putin, but there was a very interesting statement from Mikhail Gorbachev a few weeks ago, where he's still mad about that. He's still mad at Yeltsin and Kravchuk and Shushkevich for breaking up the Soviet Union. And the real surprise for Gorbachev and the people around him was, you know, they knew that Yeltsin was a bad guy, rebel. He'd been fighting them for a while. They didn't expect the Ukrainians to join him. I mean, they thought the Ukrainian Communist Party was traditionally the most repressive, especially in the 80s. They thought these guys were good, solid allies. And I still remember watching on television on the eve of the independence referendum in 1991, which, by the way, passed with an overwhelming margin. Gorbachev went on television and recited in Ukrainian a poem by Taras Shevchenko, the Ukrainian poet, saying, you know, please guys, we're all one people. Please don't break away. So this defection of the communist leadership made it possible for Ukraine to become independent, for the Soviet Union to collapse, for the CPSU rule to fall apart. But it meant the 1991 revolution was incomplete in Ukraine. And this new sort of post-Soviet, sort of aligned with the Democrats' Ukrainian leadership, wasn't terrible in the 1990s. Ukraine did have democracy, and there was a possibility for real civil society to develop. Kravchuk lost an election, democratically lost an election to Kuchma. That's a big deal. All of you political scientists know what a test that is for a government to hand over power. That happened. But after Kuchma, Leonid Kuchma, who was the next president of Ukraine, also a member of the Soviet nomenclatura, and interestingly himself from eastern Ukraine, took over, you started to see, as Putin began to build a more authoritarian, sort of kleptocratic regime in Russia, you started to see in Ukraine kind of a sense of, wouldn't that be a good idea to do here? And so you started to see Kuchma start to cut back on civil society. You started to see journalists being beaten up. Quite famously, Hyori Gongadze, a very pioneering Ukrainian journalist, was kidnapped and then found dead. Started to see this sort of creeping authoritarianism. And the final moment was the effort to fake the election and to elect Viktor Yanukovych, his name will be familiar from more recent events, fraudulently as president. That was the first moment when you really saw how strong Ukrainian civil society had become in the 13 years since independence, because Ukrainians mounted a really effective nonviolent protest, the Orange Revolution. And it worked. In the end, the regime was not willing to enforce the fraudulent election. They did poison Viktor Yushchenko, the leader of the Orange Revolution. So dirty tricks were definitely at play. But actually, a couple of weeks ago, I spent some time with Leonid Kuchma, the second Ukrainian president, the guy who tried to fraudulently have Yanukovych instated, and talked to him about some of this stuff. And he said to me, and I think this was actually an important point, that in 2004, he was unwilling to take the final step of shooting the demonstrators. He says there were people who wanted us to. The Russians definitely wanted us to. I personally was not prepared to do that. And I think that decision, and certainly Kuchma thinks that decision, is why he currently has an office in a very elegant building in central Kyiv and is a respected member of independent Ukrainian society, whereas Yanukovych has had to flee the country. So, Orange Revolution. But then, post the Orange Revolution, you had the moment which really represented something that Jeremy has alluded to, which is it's really hard. In some ways, day 2 of the revolution is the hardest part. And actually getting your act together and effectively and fairly governing these countries is incredibly difficult. And what you saw in the wake of the Orange Revolution was, sure enough, you got your new elected president. And he and the people around him failed to effectively govern the country. And they failed so strikingly, and this is sort of the part of Ukrainian history that, I think Ukraine has some wonderful writers, and I look forward to reading the novels that they're going to write about the past 20 years, because in this astonishing reversal, in 2010, Yanukovych, whose effort to fraudulently become president was so objected to by the country that there was a revolution, was actually elected as president. And that was a pretty free and fair election. What happens after that? Yanukovych turns out to be an even worse leader than the post-Orange Revolution elite. And it is important to be aware that he was ineffective on all fronts. So I was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, but before that, I was most recently in Ukraine in September. There was no one left who supported Yanukovych. Even the Eastern Ukrainian industrialists, who had never been really enthusiastic about Yanukovych, but had backed him in 2010, were completely sick and tired of him. They felt he wasn't effective as an authoritarian leader. So they weren't saying like, we want him to be a great Democrat. He just wasn't good at being an authoritarian leader. And there was tremendous complaining, really by everybody apart from Yanukovych's inner circle. So there was just literally a handful of people who felt they were wholly the beneficiaries of Yanukovych's way of running the country. Everybody else in the country, including the billionaires, felt Yanukovych's personal clannish corruption had gone too far. Now, you have to be a pretty greedy, kleptocratic leader if you're alienating even the billionaires, who are kind of doing okay, right? But even those guys had no patience left for Yanukovych. And that's significant, because I think one of the things that we saw in 2013 and 2014 was the regime melting away, the regime dissolving, no support left for him. So what happens in November 2013? Yanukovych, and again, this is something that I think has gotten lost a bit because events have changed so have taken such a dramatic turn. But as recently as November, and I saw this actually in September, Yanukovych was going to sign this European Association Agreement. There was widespread social agreement around the idea he would sign it. All three previous Ukrainian presidents, Kravchuk, the former communist guy who did the deal with the Democrats as the Soviet Union collapsed, Kuchma, former head of the Soviet Union's SS-18 missile factory, so again, a real Soviet nomenclatura guy who succeeded him, and Yushchenko, who won in the Orange Revolution. All three of them were in favor of this association agreement, and there was broad spread agreement according to opinion polls in the population and among the country's elites. They thought it was going to be hard. People expected some pushback from Russia, but they were intending to do it. And so, because there was both this expectation that it was going to happen and over 22 years, a real national consensus around the need to do this had been forged. When Yanukovych then abruptly changed his mind in November, Ukrainians were horrified. And, it can seem sort of absurd that people should be so horrified about an association agreement and, really basically the beginnings of a trade deal. What it had come to stand for is whether Ukraine, not so much this East and West thing, not about language, not about, a Huntington clash of civilizations thing. It was really a democracy versus authoritarianism. It was a sense of, do we want to live like Poland or do we want to live like Putin's Russia? And I underscore Putin's Russia because a lot of people said to me before the Maidan, before November 2013, I heard from a lot of Eastern Ukrainians, we wouldn't mind entering some kind of a customs union with Russia if it were Yeltsin's Russia, if it were a democratic Russia. We like those guys. We have a lot in common with them. We speak their language. But this is a deal with Putin's Russia. And one of them said to me, I won't use the bad language here because I guess I'm a politician, but using very bad language, he said, look, anyone who enters a club with Putin needs to expect to be expletive deleted. And if you voluntarily go into that club, then don't blame anyone else when you are expletive deleted. And so he said, look, we can't voluntarily do this. So that was the sense of things. And then what was very interesting about the dynamic of the Maidan was it started really led by a group of people, I would say remarkably similar to the people in this hall. The first sort of act which began the Maidan was a Facebook posting by a young guy called Mustafa, a student at Kyiv University, Afghan refugee, a posting in Russian where he said, guys, this is such a bad thing. Let's just go to the Maidan and protest. And it was really at the level of the kind of protest that we would do. It wasn't a lot of people. But then what you had, and this foreshadowed how Yanukovych would behave throughout the subsequent months, was this wave of a little protest, strong government repression, and then society really coming in to back the protesters. So you first had this very violent beating of the protesters. And I think, well, clearly Yanukovych thought that that would be the end. He produced a backlash. And so suddenly you had the city and indeed the whole country starting to organize around supporting the Maidan. And when I was in Kyiv, the level of self-organization there was really astonishing. They had, it became known that the best place to eat in town was on the Maidan because all of the city's restaurants, they did rotas of serving food to the Maidan. Everybody, and it was really good. It was amazing. It was really good food, all kinds of different cuisines and everything. It got to the point where even Yanukovych had paid protesters who were doing counter-protests, and after they did their pro-Yanukovych protest, they'd go to the Maidan to eat. And they actually had to be told, you're not supposed to do that, because then it seems like there are more pro-Maidan guys. And they said, yeah, but the food's better there. So, you had the food organized. It was a dry protest. No one was allowed to drink there. And that was that order was very effectively maintained, very significant. And you had really a feeling, and this lingered even afterwards, I really felt it, of the entire city having kind of signed up to this dignity revolution and having signed up to supporting the Maidan. And you had, in a lot of cities, particularly in Western Ukraine, but not only, organizing sort of shipments of people to the Maidan so that there would be enough people there. The next turning point was in January, when Yanukovych tried to impose this set of laws limiting civil society and democracy in Ukraine, kind of trying to do in one package of laws what Putin had done over the past almost decade and a half in Russia, and very much modeled along Russian lines. Real limitations on NGOs, possible limits on the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which has been, beginning in the Soviet period, a very important source of resistance. Limitations on really any independent actors in the society. And again there, this effort to sort of Russianize, Putinize, I should say, Ukraine, produced the biggest backlash of all. And from that point, the Maidan became, I think that was maybe not quite the final turning point, but from that point, the Maidan really became something to reckon with. What people said to me in Kyiv was, that's when we saw how far Yanukovych really wanted to go. And that's when we saw that he couldn't remain president. And then you had this final moment when Yanukovych crossed the line that Kuchma had not done in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, of shooting the protesters. And this really was the final line. Interestingly, I think that had less of a radicalizing effect on civil society, because civil society was really united from January. That's the moment when the regime deserted Yanukovych. And again, one of the points that I think has been underreported is the extent to which Yanukovych wasn't overthrown. Yanukovych fled because he had literally no supporters. He had fewer people willing to stand up for him than are seated at this podium. He had literally no one.